So we will begin the final session of the day. The topic of the panel is human rights and conflict resolution, and the panel is convened at the initiative and in cooperation with HaMoked, the Center for the Defense of the Individual. There has been one change in the program. Raji Sourani will not be joining us, although through the dedicated efforts of HaMoked, we managed to obtain a permit for him to enter Israel, but at the last minute his mother was very ill and he sends his regrets that he will not be able to join us. And we are very glad that Muhammad Abu Harthia at the last minute has very generously agreed to participate. In the organization of this panel, many voices were raised that in fact the topic human rights and conflict resolution is either passé or too early, in that because there is in fact no peace process now, it's not relevant to talk about the interface between human rights and conflict resolution. At the same time, it's clear that things on the ground are happening, all sorts of initiatives and developments that clearly have implications both in the diplomatic and political arena, and certainly for human rights and humanitarian law. So we will begin with Professor Eddie Kaufman of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the University of Maryland, who will talk about bridging the gap between human rights and conflict resolution.
Thank you. Do I need the mic?
Yeah, because it's on the internet as well.
You pass it to me then, I'll use it.
This one.
This one? Thank you very much, Jesse. I'm supposed to talk more about the theoretical background to this effort to try to merge two concepts that in the academia, but also in the reality world and also in the NGO world, have been featured separately. The slogan of peace and justice has been the name of many organizations around the world. When people speak about just peace, I don't know if you have seen it in one word. So it seems to be that there is a great understanding about the need to try to merge the two. But when in reality we try to do it, we discover that there have been many obstacles. When I say we, it is because part of the study I want to share with you has been done in cooperation with between Israeli and Palestinian colleagues. We published several papers and articles in journals with Ibrahim Bisharat and then with Mohammed Abu Nimer, myself. And also we had a little study group that helped us conceptualizing that. I'm so glad to see that includes my friend to the right, Advocate Abu Harthia, was one of those who advised us on the project. So, and eventually, once we had the concept that I want to share with you, we tried to get a grant to see if we can have human rights and peace organizations, both Israelis and Palestinians, to work together across the divide. And when I say across the divide, it's not only the Israeli-Palestinian divide, but also human rights and peace organizations in Israel. As we know, there's not a lot of interaction, just to give an example, between B'Tselem and Peace Now. And the question is, why are there things that are common concerns of both human rights and peace organizations? So the concept peace and justice has been around for a long time, but the effort to conceptualize it in terms of human rights being the instrumentality of justice. If you ask people what is justice, you may get many opinions, but if you really want to know what is the consensus opinion, then this is the internationally recognized human rights as we see it. When you ask about peace, then you have to really work on conflict resolution methods to be able to reach peace. So we say the instrumentalities of peace and justice are basically conflict resolution and human rights. Now, in the academia, I mean, the human rights angle comes heavily from the law school, as we know. And the peace angle, the conflict resolution angle, comes heavily from the social sciences. So we have two paradigms that don't really meet, even at the university. I teach a course on human rights, and I teach a course on conflict resolution. But I can tell you there are two different programs. One is one program, the other one is another program. There's no one place. Very few places now around the world. There are 3 or 4 universities that have a major or a graduate program on human rights and conflict resolution. But still, the tradition has been to see that as two separate disciplines. In Israel, we used to have large peace movements, not only organizations, And most of the human rights NGOs are skeleton NGOs, are small NGOs, and not movements. I mean, they are staff-driven NGOs. If you look at the Palestinian society, there are no large peace movements, even very few NGOs that would call themselves peace. Sometimes conflict resolution, it's okay, but peace has a sense of a problem, whereas we have many human rights organizations. So here we see the gap already in the two societies between peace and human rights and conflict resolution. And we look at the style of the way they work. I mean, human rights organizations tend to be more confrontational towards the authorities. Conflict resolution organizations tend to be more conciliatory towards the government. Human rights demand matters in terms of principle. Conflict resolution organizations, they try to mediate. They try to look for compromises for common ground. So the style is different. The human rights organizations obviously focus on rights. Conflict resolution speaks about needs, and some of the needs are not tangible needs like land, but also non-tangible needs like recognition, acknowledgement, and this is considered to be part of the resolution of the conflict. Not only rights, but also non-tangible issues. So here you get a sense about the problem of trying to bring together not only two concepts, but also two groups of people that the way of thinking and acting is different. You can say maybe some people are speaking about ending occupation, and they may think about the other, thinking about humanizing occupation. You ask yourself, what is the point? We have to look into the final status solutions. We really have to solve the conflict. We are only, even maybe if it's worse now, perhaps it's better later. Whereas the other groups say, no, there is an immense amount of suffering. The level of hatred, if it increases, is an obstacle to peace. And therefore, we work for peace by working for human rights today. So you can get the sense of the dyadic approach towards the issue. Now, in the study that we conducted together, we asked ourselves, what would have been different in the Oslo process if the question of human rights would have been featured there silently? And we believe there would have been a lot of difference. By the way, we did an analysis of the several hundreds of pages of all the Oslo Accords. My research assistant, Sonia Martinez, is sitting somewhere there, and she knows more than I do about it. But there were less than 15 mentions to the term human rights in all through the documents, and sometimes just to a catchword, just to say human rights, without any real substance. Now, to make it even worse, the roadmap has no mention, and the Geneva Accord has some better mention, but still short of what I would anticipate. And also, in terms of, we did a content analysis of the speeches of both Sharon and Arafat, and I can tell you, Sharon never used the term human rights, except once in Aqaba. And when he met Abu Mazen, I wonder who wrote the speech, but that was the only time it was mentioned. Arafat mentions rights all the time, but he mentions Palestinian rights. I never heard him saying universal rights for both Arabs and Jews. So we really have a serious problem at the leadership level. Even the Oslo people, the pragmatics of Oslo, did not bother to look into human rights as a standard setting for what they have to do later. I'm not saying that you cannot deviate from standard setting, but if you don't speak about standards, how do you know you are deviating? Everything becomes a Middle East bazaar of numbers of kilometers and not about the principles that should have been guided us before we go into the bargaining. If you look into the question of human rights as a component of peace processes, firstly, most likely you're going to make a big differentiation between our conflict with Syria and our conflict with the Palestinians. We say the conflict with Syria, or as it was with Egypt in a way, is a border dispute. It's a border dispute, is an interstate conflict between two established states. The conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is a people's conflict, let alone that there are only 35,000 people living in the Golan Heights, and even before, there were not many. Quneitra was the only large city was given back to Syria. But we are now talking about a human problem rather than not only a territorial problem, but above all a human problem. I mean, the Israel-Palestine problem is a nation versus state. It's not a state versus state. It's a nation versus state. It's an intrastate problem because we control their lives. And therefore the modalities are very different. And it is really a sad recognition that that was not really part of the formulation of the Oslo process. They dealt with it, including Barak, by talking to Syria before talking to the Palestinians, if you remember the strategy and so on. Like the two things are equal. Nobody is pressurizing Israel to compromise on the Golan, if you look at the international community. All the pressure has to do with the Palestinians, because these are people suffering, 3.5 million people, and this is such a different situation. So they put the human rights in the equation. It's a very important element for doing a true peace process. So in the project that we did together, we did a couple of things, but this project, we asked ourselves if we would have included human rights in the peace process, also peace process, how different could that be? Well, let alone that, and so let's look into the pre-negotiation, the negotiation, and the post-negotiation period. Because at the international level, it is well accepted nowadays that when you finish a peace treaty, if you want to consolidate peace, then you really have to put human rights a lot, like in South Africa. Namely, you have a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. They deal with all the issues of the healing, of the reconciliation, justice, punishment, and everything. But it is post-conflict. They call it transitional justice. The word justice comes there. But now, we in our understanding was, we hope we could have reached this stage to deal with post-conflict. But the trouble is that if we don't start now, including human rights, we may not be able to make it to a peace accord. This is what we're trying to say. So we look into the pre-conflict, during conflict, or not pre-conflict, sorry, pre-negotiation, negotiation, and post-negotiation. Although post-negotiation for us, it's a utopia now, especially in the last few years. It looks like the day, not the day after tomorrow. But at the time when we started the project, that was before the Intifada al-Aqsa, and we thought we also have to relate to, there will be a peace accord, then what needs to be done afterwards. But in the first stage, which is before the actual negotiations, the declaratory stage, we regret that human rights was not put there, like in Northern Ireland, for instance, as a part and parcel of the terminology of the accord to be signed. If you only take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and you quote the first two sentences, just the preamble, that sets the tone of equality, which is to be guiding us in the negotiation. It doesn't mean to say that the powerful is not going to get some more gain, but at least the starting point is the recognition of equality of all human beings. And the language is beautiful, by the way, of the Universal Declaration. It could have been copied there literally. So we have some concerns in our work about the fact that nobody thought about it, I mean, at that stage. But then during the negotiations, and this is very crucial because we said human rights could have been used both as a confidence-building measure and, interestingly, also in the final status issues, because this is something that people perhaps was not so much aware. During the peace process, such a long peace process that eventually, did not deliver, what we call human rights as confidence-building measure, it has been also called peace dividends sometimes. Or what do you gain from peace? And we were trying to say it's not only what you gain, what you should not lose through a peace process, because the human rights situation deteriorated through the peace process. So the paradox is that the expectations of the people are going up, because there's going to be peace, and the human rights standards are going down. Obviously of the Palestinians, and also of the Israelis, because the standard of living, and of course the suicide bombing and everything seems to be going in the wrong direction. So we have a long list of do and don't do that we would have liked the government to say, I cannot do, for instance, house demolition. I should never do house demolition, but definitely doing a peace process, because this is contrary, to tell the Israeli public, this is contrary to Article so and so. There are so many documents that can be quoted. If there is an adherence, at least during the peace process, to this universally accepted international human rights covenants. And administrative detention, the large number of administrative detainees. I also think that the Palestinian Authority should also look self-critically about some of the things that are, the question of incitement. I mean, there is a lot of coverage in the covenant against racial discrimination about the kind of things that were shown in the Palestinian media. Surely a more clear standard position against the suicide bombing that attempts against the right to life and so on. So we have a long list of do and don't do, what our government should have done during the time. And eventually, when I come to the final status issues, that's where perhaps including human rights, inserting human rights, would generate some new perspectives that were not considered before. I think it was done a little bit on the issue of water, although it seems not to be anymore one of the issues that have been they didn't reach a consensus. I mean, there is a consensus about water, which is based on a mixture of water rights, minimal water rights to everybody, equal rights, and then a pricing policy about the use of water. I can't elaborate, but I don't know that we have the time to do that. So even at B'Tselem has been mostly involved in monitoring the real human rights violations. We did try to work on the issue of water with a long-term perspective, and we wanted to look into the question of refugees from a human rights perspective. And, I have something to say also about Jerusalem. If you take the Jerusalemites' rights first, because when you deal with rights, you have to deal with individual rights of the people directly affected. So it's not so important to deal with the international community in Jerusalem or the capital of two states and Jerusalem, but just what is good for the inhabitants of Jerusalem and so on. So we have done quite some homework about how could the next peace process look differently if it will insert human rights in the agenda. However, I have a very few minutes. I just want to tell you that the last piece we did is an article that was published, actually, a short version in the Palestine-Israel Journal, the last issue. And the title is Human Rights Good for the Top Dog as Well? Because in the process of dealing with it, we realized very clearly that it's not difficult to sell human rights to the underdog. The underdog that is going for rescue and help to the international community and is asking the international community to help is also asking international law to help. And is also obviously asking the human rights standards to help them out of the situation. The real challenge, to be pragmatic, is how to sell the idea that human rights is also good for the powerful, for the top dog. And that's where we did. This is our last piece of work. And we have developed about 15 arguments. I wish I could experiment with the audience. I don't know if the audience will be the kind of audience that is representing the establishment of Israel, but I doubt. But if that would be, I've tried it a couple of times in neutral places where quite a large number of the people are not identified with those who are concerned about humanitarian and human rights issues, to see if it flies. And I can tell you some eyes are open, and there are arguments that obviously the 242 resolution was drafted in a way that implied already at that time, it spoke about the language of saying a just and lasting peace. We were wondering, why do you need to qualify the term peace? But you needed to, because the term justice was coming from the Palestinian side, and the term lasting was coming from the Israeli side. Basically, lasting means we want to last as close as the status quo reality as much as possible. Whereas the Palestinians were saying peace without justice, because we are the powerless in this equation, is not going to help us to achieve our minimal rights. So I think that because time is out, I leave you with all these questions. Some of the material is being published, so if you want to read more about the top dog analysis and the other general understanding, how can you enrich a peace process with human rights at all stages, rather than the post-negotiation stages, it's all available. We wanted to continue now to do a last project on the issue of freedom of movement, because you see, this is an interesting issue, Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it has a lot of peace war consequences. Freedom of movement of the Palestinians is limited by the wall. I don't have to tell you, fence, stroke, wall. I don't have to tell you how the world is closing the option of a viable Palestinian state and peace, but obviously the day-to-day life, the human rights of the people that have been affected by the war is a large number of Palestinians. Or if you take the checkpoints, just to give another element of the freedom of movement, the checkpoints are definitely perhaps the most massive collective punishment for all the Palestinian people, and it's all over the place. But it is also increasing the level of hatred towards Israel, which is a concern of national security. By keeping, humiliating, and stopping the population to have access to, the very basic needs, hospitals and movement and so on, we are ourselves increasing the level of hatred, which is an obstacle to peace. So this is just to give you the example about one article of the Universal Declaration. How can you use it both ways for peace and human rights? And thank you.
Mohammed Abu Harthia is a lawyer who has been active in the Palestinian NGO human rights community for years, and now a human rights officer with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights office in Ramallah.
Good evening. I would like to start by thanking you in person and Maria for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here, although I was wishing that I came early in the morning to be with you all. But I think I would start from where Eddie finished. It was, I think that sometimes people very quickly go into concepts and words. And while I was listening, I was thinking how much damage sometimes scholars and jurists and writers can make without any intention. And I will focus in the next 15 minutes about these concepts that change by time. But I would like to start by saying when I went for the first lecture in humanitarian law, when I was doing my postgraduate degree, the professor said that a soldier can't kill a soldier, but, and the whole rest of 2 years was about these buts. But I was listening last week to the Israeli news in the morning, and something shocked me, and I said, I don't want to be a Palestinian for 2 minutes, just to be anyone else. And then I thought, after I heard the news that Palestine occupied Israel, maybe this is true 3,000 years ago, but as if it was yesterday that the Palestinians occupied Israel. Because when you hear Sharon and Bush are speaking about the justification of extrajudicial killing in revenge to killing a soldier on checkpoint, it makes you doubt about all what you have learned and done in the field of human rights and humanitarian law. So I think this conference is very important to focus on these issues. Because if we follow politicians, at least as jurists and philosophers and thinkers and people with clean conscience and good hearts, I think they will mislead us. Because we were talking about politicizing humanitarian law. We were talking about damaging to international law. What is happening in this question is damage to international law. But how can we stop it? How we can expose it now before it makes more damage to international law? Maybe some people would be pleased that there is damage to humanitarian law when it comes to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. But I don't think the international community would like it in the future, because it took long time to establish a just international law, to end an era of the laws of the jungle, when only the strong can rule, when the strong can beat the weak without any question. If we go back to this era, I think that what we have achieved since 1945, since the whole world, or at least Europe and the Western countries, decided that respect for humanitarian law and human rights is the only way to put an end for atrocities that would at least terminate lives of millions of people. And I think this week have reminded us with the Holocaust, And I think the Holocaust is something horrible that we don't want to see in the future. So as not to see this in the future, and as a Palestinian who would like also to mention this today, because we were against, we should be against, and we don't want to see it, neither to the Jews or to any other nation, we have to be careful of how international law is twisted these days. First of all, I think the word terror becomes a word that we can violate any human rights anywhere in the world, not only here, by this magic word. Any leader today can say that this torture is going place in Pakistan, in Iran, in India, in Saudi Arabia, in Israel, because we are fighting terrorism. Anyone can also go in a very sophisticated airplane or chopper or whatever and assassinate people and say this is preventive action of terror also. And we have seen this happening. So how can we think about this world in a way that, of course, and I would agree totally with the statement that we hear every day, Israel has the right to defend its citizens. It's true. Any leader has the obligation even to protect the lives of the people that he is responsible for. But do you want to justify violations of human rights in that sense? How can we rephrase this to say an occupier has the obligation to protect its army? This is the first rule of humanitarian law, and here I would stop on the first concept that scholars made damage to. When they decided to change the laws of war into humanitarian law. Because what's happening in Rafah, when the bulldozers and the tanks demolished 20, 30, 100 houses because they were looking for a tunnel, this is laws of war. When they set checkpoints in between Khan Yunis and Rafah, this is humanitarian law. So let's differentiate first between the laws of war, which does not allow an occupier to do something, and between humanitarian law as a whole, which governs the situation of an occupied territories after the war is over. So we're living at the same time in two different situations. In one place, in one moment, we are under the ceiling or umbrella of laws of war, and in another place, in another moment, we have to be governed by humanitarian law. What we do in both cases? How can we go out of it? Maybe I won't leave it just a question, but we will talk about it in a bit later. Because I would go back to the other thing. When we also confuse people between human rights and humanitarian law, and we are talking about a situation where there is an occupier who refuses to abide by human rights laws, which, as you said, it is legal school or school of law, and where you find that this occupier have ratified all the conventions and treaties, but he says it doesn't apply except to the Israelis. So its jurisdiction exceeds the borders of 1949 truce borders to the settlers in the occupied territories, but refuse to, I would say, that would refuse even to talk about any person that this human rights agreement might give any support. So even foreigners who live in that area would not be also protected by those agreements. On the other hand, we're talking about customary laws, which the occupier is saying, yes, I would abide by these customary laws, but I only abide by also humanitarian aspects of the Geneva Conventions. So how can you differentiate between the humanitarian aspects and the laws of war? This is very, very difficult, because freedom of movement is one issue that on one moment you can say it is part of a military necessity, this means laws of war. And second thing, you could say it's a collective punishment, then it's humanitarian law. then it has to do with the right to make a living, then with the right to work, then you go into human rights, and then you go into individual rights instead of group rights. Then you go into human rights. This complexity of the situation makes it very difficult for non-politicians to see the danger of the damage that is happening today by saying that an occupier has the right to protect its citizens. How we consider settlers in this problem? Are they protected because they are protected by the Israeli law and human rights treaties? Or they are protected, or should be protected in the occupied territory because they are Jews? Or they should be protected because Israel has an obligation to protect every individual in the occupied territories. If the question is that Israel is responsible to protect every individual in the occupied territories, this means including Palestinians. This is the best situation that we can reach. But if it divides those people living there between its citizens and non-citizens or enemies, then how can you apply human rights in that area? How you can apply even humanitarian? So when Bush and Sharon says killing a soldier on areas justifies extrajudicial killing, we have to ask, what is extrajudicial killing? Is it forbidden because it is a bad issue? Against our values, against our morals? Or is it because it is illegal by all these norms, by all these laws, to take the life of a person without, first of all, by humanitarian law, cause a direct threat to a soldier or in a military operation, or this person, I would say, or there's no or, I would say, or you try to catch this person and he escapes and you shoot and you use all the human rights standards of policing anti-demonstration, catching a criminal, you shoot in the air, you shoot in the leg, you shout, you alert, and then he doesn't stop, and then you kill him. So, how you put the assassination into this frame? Is it in protection of human rights, or is it a violation of human rights? I think that humanitarian law have jumped one step further, which we have to take into consideration, when they established the International Court of Justice. Although we know that it won't look into any case before July 2002, it means all the previous actions would not be dealt with, and in our case maybe it will take another 10 years. But according to the own statute of this court, all of these are war crimes. So either we are saying these are not war crimes, or we are saying if the Israelis are doing it, it's not a war crime. If it happens by anybody else, then it's a war crime. I think we have to protect international law. I think maybe I confused many of you because I was confused myself. Usually when I'm asked to come for a lecture on human rights and humanitarian law, when it has to do with Palestine-Israel conflict, it's the easiest. 15 minutes would have been maybe unfair for the subject and for me. But today I felt that with what is happening, 15 minutes, it's a very long time to talk about international law. Because two people are deciding to change it at the time when we told the refugees in 48, don't worry. 194 is a UN resolution which should be implemented one day. You have not just a customary law that protects you. The Magna Carta itself in 1215 has spoken about every person has the right to leave his country and come back whenever he wants. Israel recognized the right to return for the Jews after 3,000 years. So why are you afraid? And the same people that we told them to sacrifice their human daily life for a political cause, today we came and told them we will let you down. Sorry, we can't get you back or solve the end of your problem. It's out of question. It's not for discussion. Who will compensate those people? who will compensate their suffering only for the damage we did as jurists, as philosophers, as the UN, who told those people, we will solve your problem because you have a protected right in the international legitimacy. And today, I think, we are doing the same mistake. So we have to be very careful. Are we promising the Palestinians that humanitarian law would protect their rights forever? Because the other lesson I learned when I was studying the Geneva Conventions, that because at the end of the day there will be two sides sitting on both sides of the table negotiating, one is winning and one is losing, we will protect the losing side, the weak side, by saying you cannot give up your rights that you gained by this agreement. So it means we won't allow you to give up any parts of occupied East Jerusalem. We won't allow you to allow settlers to stay in the occupied territories unless you have established self-determination and independent state. We won't allow you to give up any right even to punish those perpetrators. So today when we tell them no, settlements became legal, annexation of land is legal, the right to return is denied and it is legal. So what we are telling them, the Geneva Convention does not apply. So what we will do with the thousands of resolutions that we have collected over 35 years from the Human Rights Commission, the General Assembly, ECOSOC, even Security Council resolutions. This was all lies. So who will compensate? And that's why I would end by answering one thing that I heard that in this morning it was an issue of discussion. What shall we do with donors and humanitarian aid? Shall we stop it or keep it? I think that it is like a sword, with both sides. I think that we have to work, because you said until long-lasting peace. Now, I think that until that peace would be achieved, we should not wait for minimizing the suffering first, because we're talking humanitarian law, or protecting human rights, or at least making the lives of those people under occupation a little bit better. Because if we stop aid, we are telling them like the refugees, you have to suffer until we reach peace. No, we have not to let them suffer. Even as long as occupation continues, we have to give them all the support we can give. Even if we support one individual, if we can lift the suffering of one individual, I think that we have done a lot. Thank you very much.
Danny Seidmann will speak next, an attorney dealing most prominently on issues related to Jerusalem on the topic of the human rights dimension of political affairs.
Good evening. First of all, I'm a practitioner. I come from the field. And for the last 13, 14 years, what I've done is get up in the morning and scan the horizon in a very small sandbox called Jerusalem, particularly East Jerusalem, say, what the hell can go wrong here today? And when I say what can go wrong here, it's really come down to three different dimensions. What can happen in the city that will deprive us, Israelis and Palestinians, or our children, from arriving at a political agreement, the irreversibility effects on the ground. The second dimension is what will release the volatile gases that can ignite the city, because we live in a rather volatile city. And Jerusalem has a reputation of being nitroglycerin, and it's more like an atomic device. There are a finite number of things that ignite it. And the third dimension is that of humanitarian issue, which is going to make people's lives worse, significantly deprived them of fundamental human rights. But it's not accidental that that's third on my list. And to a certain extent, as a practitioner, I probably, in a discourse on human rights, come from the wrong side of the divide. I come with a prejudice, just changed a bit over the years, that the resolution of conflict is political, and human rights can ameliorate the suffering of people until the politicians become wise. It's a very, very primitive discourse, and I'm reflecting on what Eddie presented here theoretically from the perspective of practitioner. I'll give you one small example. In 1995, a new road was being cut down from Beit Jal Gilo down into Jerusalem. It was being done illegally. These are the things that I have a lot of fun with, exposing the illegalities and making people's lives in government miserable. And I probably could have held it up for months, but this was a Rabin government, and they were doing it for a good cause, and they wanted to redeploy in Bethlehem and to withdraw, so they cut this scar down. It's the Walliger Road, which actually raped the terrain. And I said, well, no, all right, if we want to redeploy, let it ride. And of course, the road is there, Rabin is dead, Oslo's dead, and this is now serving the settlers, and so much for my wisdom in 1995. My jaundiced perspective was changed by a number of events. First of all, I want to thank you people for giving me the opportunity for the first time in months to speak about something other than the wall. So I'm not going to talk about the wall. You may be bored, but I won't. I want to talk about something that once existed in the region, sort of like a semi-extinct animal, the political process. And to give you three small vignettes which have changed my perspective on the interface between political process and humanitarian perspectives. And they have to deal with a number of events during a short 6 months, 7 months period in the year 2000. In about May of 2000, right before Camp David, I was contacted by the American negotiating team, and they asked me to give them bar mitzvah lessons on what Jerusalem is. It's also indicative of the depth of the decision-making process in the American government, where you start drawing maps on napkins in the lobby of the King David. I'm not kidding. And I took the senior members of the team out to show them what they would be carving up shortly thereafter. And we stood on a hill in Beit Hanina. And one of the senior members of the team said, oh, we can lop this off and turn it into Palestine. And I said, yeah, but if you do that, you're going to be creating a disaster, because it's not enough to take out a scalpel and start dividing the territory. So, well, what do you mean? It's very simple. The gross domestic product in Palestine was then something like $1,300 per capita. In East Jerusalem, it was $3,500. In West Jerusalem, it was $15,000. The fact that the vans of the American government have turned up in Beit Hanina this morning have already made property values drop. I'm not kidding. People were scared. It's not that they wanted to remain Israeli or against the process, but there was trepidation. It is not enough to take out the scalpel and redraw the lines. You cannot have a credible political process by plummeting people into poverty, by depriving them of the basis of employment, by making the level of healthcare and all sorts of things worse. And if there's any lesson, and I agree with any of the Oslo years, is that the process made people's lives worse, and as a result of that, discredited the process. The answer was, you can't have it both ways. And my response was, you have to have it both ways if you expect to have a sustainable agreement. The politicians, for very understandable reasons, are focused, can we agree? But it's rare that they ask the will you respect me in the morning question. Namely, you've agreed on something. Will it be sustainable the day after? And very often the opportunity, one mortgages the future, and I talk about the humanitarian future, in order to arrive at an agreement here and now. We'll come back to this in a moment, but I want to proceed to the next meeting, which was probably the most shocking one. I was very concerned about this, and I decided to make the rounds not only among the American, but to talk to people in the Israeli negotiating team and among the Palestinians to express my concerns that experts on expertise with dabbling with rather difficult issues without understanding the full ramifications. So I went to a key person associated, not a key member of the Israeli negotiating team, but a purely an Oslo person, and expressed my concerns that the kinds of arrangements that were being dealt with, specifically concerning East Jerusalem, were inadequate, to say the least. Namely, that this is something that would be perhaps politically correct in order to arrive at an agreement, but would deprive people of certain fundamental basic rights. The answer I received, I'm astounded by today, and the person's going to remain anonymous because I still have respect for him. 2 bullets by Jabril Rajub will solve the problem. Well placed under the ear of the disgruntled individuals in Beit Hanina. We're on the brink of an historic event, human rights concerns are not the kinds of things that should be allowed to get underfoot. It was kind of the adverse of the democratization demand of George W. Bush. George W. Bush demanding that democratization so that the democracy of Iraq and Palestine will look like that of southern Florida during an election campaign, as a pretext not to deal with these issues. But here's the adverse side. Isn't it nice that we have a police state opposite us? The humanitarian record of Jordan and Egypt are not impeccable, and look, they made peace with us. The third meeting was with the late Faisal Husseini, whose initial response was more vegetarian, but initial, not a lot different. We Palestinians will not countenance a first-class Palestinian citizen and a second-class Palestinian citizen. There are going to be Palestinians, East Jerusalem will become Palestinian, and the hell with it. It was good, the circumstances were good because we had a lot of time, I had a lot of time with Faisal Husseini, who was marginalized. This actually took place during and around Camp David, and he was marginalized. We had a lot of time, so we'd meet at 7 o'clock in the morning. And Faisal was somewhat unique because of all of the people I've spoken about. He really was tied almost by an intravenous to a constituency. And he understood what I was talking about. And in the months that ensued prior to his death, in track 2 discussions, we were able to explore all sorts of mechanisms of how it would be possible to have a political division of Jerusalem without making people's lives worse. Amortize the national insurance. The residents of East Jerusalem paid hundreds of millions of shekels into Bituach Leumi national insurance. Amortize it, top it off. Separate it from Israel, but provide the entitlements. Provide every Palestinian in East Jerusalem has a blue ID card. Take away the blue ID card. Give him a Palestinian passport. Be politically correct, but also in a coordinated manner, give him a lifetime work visa into Israel so that the fall is buffeted and things of that nature. Health insurance. There were ways of dealing with this. It wasn't a question of the hard-headed politicians who have realpolitik in mind versus the utopian humanitarians who were getting underfoot, but there were real and available solutions, but they weren't being addressed. And I think that when we come around to this next time, hopefully there will be a next time, we will be in a better position on this very small sandbox called East Jerusalem to demonstrate a number of things. First of all, the public image, or the popular image, of using Eddie's terms, the conflict resolvers, who are the real politicians, as opposed to the dreamy humanitarians, isn't true. I still think that the decisions will be indeed political, and they'll be made by politicians who answer to a constituency in one way or another. But unless the discourse, unless the negotiations, and unless the results are informed by humanitarian issues, it is the conflict resolvers, the politicians who are doing the dreaming, unless the issues that are informed by the work of Jessica in B'Tselem or Dalia at the HaMoked are inside the room of the negotiations. That which is agreed upon is jeopardized. The image that I saw in the 2 first people that I met with, the Oslo person, the Americans, was an image of almost a Yechidat Miluim, a reserve unit in the Israeli army, where at the end of Miluim you transfer signatures, where on the day when you implement the agreement, Jessica will go to the French-Hill Junction and transfer signatures for the responsibility of the human rights of the Palestinians to Bassem Eid. That won't work. It's more complicated than that. Reluctantly, I've arrived at the conclusion that unless the yeast of a human rights dialogue is brought into this process of political discussions, the politicians will not be able to create sustainable agreements. Has the lesson been learned? I'll give you just one small, short answer. I've looked at Geneva. And I've been involved with the people with Geneva, and I've spoken with them, and I've said, where are these issues? The answer is, you're right, we'll get to them. No. In human rights, the window of opportunity never exists. It's either too early or too late. And it's the jobs of people who are engaged in this to make sure, no, Geneva people now, they have to be addressed now, because if you don't address them now, you're going to forget them, just like you did last time. Thank you.
We take a few steps back from our local conflict and see what lessons we can learn from conflict resolution and human rights in other places. We're very glad to have with us Agneta Johansson, both from the Swedish section of the International Commission of Jurists and with the International Legal Assistance Consortium, to talk about human rights in a peace process, the Bosnian experience.
Yes, thank you very much. This is the last lecture for today. The title of my presentation is Human Rights in a Peace Process. Yes, the Bosnian experience. So what I intend to do is to give you some examples from the actual agreement, the Dayton Peace Agreement, and you can compare it with Oslo if you like. I will not do that. I will also then give you some examples from the practical work of implementation with human rights, implementing or trying to implement the Dayton Peace Agreement after it was signed. And I will finally tell you a little about the result and give you some of my views why I think the result became the result it is today. Very briefly first, I worked 3 years in Bosnia all in all. Came there 96, spring 96, and you know the Dayton Agreement was signed in November 95. So I was among the first internationals to arrive to Bosnia. I worked for OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And my first task was to establish a field office in Visegrad as a human rights officer. Visegrad is a small little town in the Eastern Republic Srpska. And after a couple of months, I was transferred, or what we should say. So I became the senior human rights officer in that part of Republika Srpska. So my area of responsibility then was basically the Eastern Republic Srpska, the very hardline area where Karadzic and Mladic had their real constituency. Later on, I was working also for the Office of the High Representative. Just very briefly, some figures from the war. You know, the war in Bosnia was, of course, only a part of the war in the Balkans, but in Bosnia only, around 200,000 people were killed. We estimate that around 2 million people had to flee or leave their homes during these 4 years of real war that took place. 1 million fled into neighboring countries or further into other countries in Europe, but we had 1 million left in Bosnia, displaced. That can be good to know. And even if, you know, ethnic cleansing as a strategy or as a method has been used before, in several wars. It was during the war in Bosnia that it actually, the term was created. And in some wars, I mean, the movement of people are the result of war or the violent actions. But in Bosnia, it was the purpose of the war, to actually move people around, to have these ethnic cleansed areas. The task of the international community, or the principle that we stick to, and what also is formulated in the Dayton Agreement, was to keep this as one country. But if I may use that expression, realities on the ground after the war had of course created these two entities, which, the Republika Srpska was completely 100% Serb citizens or people after the war, and we had the Federation, which was both Muslims or Bosniaks, as they prefer to be called, and Croats. But even in the Federation, it was completely divided. So we had pure Croat municipalities and pure Muslim Bosniak municipalities. So that was the situation. As a result of that recognition, that the international community had, that the atrocities of the war was caused by poor respect or no respect for fundamental human rights principles, the Dayton Agreement came to emphasize that this new country that we were going to create should be a democratic state operating under the rule of law, and both on the state level, the national level, as well as on the entity levels. This was really emphasized, and both these entities should ensure the highest level of recognized human rights standards and fundamental freedoms. You remember, I am sure, that the Dayton Agreement, we can't really say that that is an expression of the will of the parties who signed it. I mean, they were locked in the Air Force base there in Dayton, and they had to sign it. So what we can see it as, I think, is an expression of the will of the international community, actually. And they really wanted here to put strong emphasis on human rights. And I will give you some examples. The agreement itself is very short. It's just one page. But then it has 11 annexes, different issues. But this page, 11 articles, 2 articles actually, is about human rights and international humanitarian law. And I will actually read it to you. Recognizing that the observance of human rights and the protection of refugees and displaced persons are of vital importance in achieving a lasting peace, the parties agree and shall comply fully with the provisions concerning human rights set forth in this annex. And we have a whole annex only about human rights. And then the article about international humanitarian law says that the parties shall cooperate fully with all entities involved in implementation of this peace agreement, as described in the annexes, or which are otherwise authorized by the United Nations Security Council, pursuant to the obligation of all parties to cooperate in the investigation and prosecution of war crimes and other violations of international humanitarian law. One of the annexes is the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which the parties signed also. And here, I just want to emphasize, it actually says here in the preamble that the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina is inspired by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenants on Civil Political Rights, Social Cultural Rights, and the Declaration of the Rights of Minorities. And then, this is interesting actually, and this shows the strength that we have here. The rights and freedoms set forth in the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms and its protocols shall apply directly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. These shall have priority over all other law. And finally, just a couple of examples from the Annex on Human Rights. Basically, it talks about that they had to establish a commission on human rights, consists of two parts, the Office of the Ombudsman and the Human Rights Chamber. Both of them can receive complaints from individuals, from organizations, people who think that their rights have been violated. It says that the ombudsperson should be an international to start with, a non-citizen of Bosnia. It's still an international, as far as I know. Last year it was a Swede. The Human Rights Chamber was composed by the three main groups, Serbs, Croats and Muslims, and by internationals. So it's most about that. But I would like to, since we have many NGOs here, I would like to read one provision here regarding organizations concerned with human rights. The parties have signed here that the parties shall promote and encourage the activities of non-governmental and international organizations for the protection and promotion of human rights. The parties join in inviting the United Nations Commissioner on Human Rights, OSCE, etc., the UNHCR, and other intergovernmental or regional human rights missions or organizations to monitor closely the human rights situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, including through the establishment of local offices and the assignment of observers, rapporteurs, or other relevant persons, and provide them with full and effective facilitation, assistance, and access. So, I mean, we had a lot to work from, as you understand. The problem in Bosnia was, of course, that the parties, when the agreement was signed, they couldn't continue to fight themselves with military, with weapons. But they actually continued to fight themselves through the administration, through the implementation of this. So it became really the international community. I mean, it became our responsibility, more or less, to try to force this implementation of the agreement. But we had, as you have heard, a very strong theoretical base to do that. But that is not enough. We also had practical mechanisms. You all know about the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. So we had actually a court established by the Security Council. Okay, it took some time before it was really operating, and one can, have different opinions about the efficiency and so on, but it was there and it was working, and it was a threat to people, who had committed violations and at least thought twice for doing it again. And more important, we had actually the military, the international implementation force behind our back. They were also a bit slow in the beginning to actually act against these people who were accused of war crimes and indicted by The Hague. But after a while, I mean, they really went after them, arrested them, or if they were fleeing or were shot back, I mean, they some of them were killed also. So we had this to our disposal, and we had a huge monitoring mechanisms. And as I said, I was part of this OSCE mission. And that was the task given to OSCE, actually, to be human rights monitors. And we established field offices. And as I said, my office was in Visegrad, and from there I covered 5 municipalities. And I can't say now how many offices we had, but we really covered the area of Bosnia and Herzegovina. What we could say in retrospect is maybe that it wasn't so necessary maybe to have so many human rights officers, because it turned out that many of the human rights officers were a bit too young. They were very enthusiastic, but maybe it would have been better to have, older, more experienced people. And we also had, not all of them were lawyers, far from all. And as I said, when I was a regional human rights officer, I had several of these field officers working under me. And I had 2 journalists, for example. And their reports, when they came in every week, they were extremely interesting to read, but I couldn't use them, as a human rights report, because it was a lot of speculations and so on. Very interesting, but they were not really up to the job. But we had the eyes out there. We saw what was going on. We had people present in the courts, visited the police stations, talking to the press, to the media, and so on. But we were all internationals. And that is one thing that I want to mention. We didn't have local human rights groups to link up with. In my area there, we found one individual who had an affiliated membership with the Helsinki Committee. But that was one person. So it was really, artificial in a way, that it was the internationals monitoring the locals, but we couldn't really connect with the people there. So we had all this at our disposal. So what about the result then? Yeah, well, can't really say that we succeeded. The last election, which is almost 10 years after the Dayton Peace Agreement, the nationalistic parties took the majority votes again. We have a lot of people who have, claimed back their property in the courts. We have a lot of court decisions, but they have never been implemented. So the refugees have, to a very large extent, not been able to go back. They are still displaced. So it is obvious that the political and judicial authorities of Bosnia and Herzegovina, both local and international, because we still have a very strong international presence with the Office of the High Representative in Bosnia, have failed to transform the rhetoric of all this into reality. And in fact, the economic progress in Bosnia the recent years have been really jeopardized by the accelerating increase of corruption, of organized crimes, and of general lawlessness, I must say. And if I should give you some of my view, and actually it's not only my view, we are several who are, quite agree upon some of the real big mistakes that we did. Of course, some of the problems have to do with the long history of communism, central planning, and isolation of the country. And other reasons are, of course, also related to physical and psychological aftermath of this war. But despite all these international efforts and invested resources, human and financial, we must also question what we did, since it hasn't succeeded. And I think that in some case we could have done better. But in some cases, I even think that we made things worse. And the example I want to take there is that we had 2 early elections. And as you know, it's not only here that the US internal politics can play a role. During this period, we had Clinton as a president in the United States, and he was up for re-election. And when they moved in all the American troops to Bosnia, which was, of course, the main bulk, as usual, of the international force, Clinton made these promises that some of you might remember. The boys will be home for Christmas. And, the peace agreement was signed in November 95, and, they were supposed to return home Christmas 96. And in order to manage that, I mean, which was stupid to start with, I mean, everyone who knew anything and were involved knew that that would be absolutely impossible. But this was what they played out, the card that they say. And the Bosnian public, they bought it, so they became afraid that they were, that we would lead. And maybe the American public bought it, I don't know. He was re-elected, so maybe. But the way to manage this in Bosnia was that there should be elections already in September '96, so not even a year after the peace agreement was signed. And OSCE was signed to actually organize this election. And that was, of course, one of the first mistakes that we did, talking about human rights, because then the OSCE should organize and take care of the elections so that they went smoothly and in the right way, while the human rights mechanism of the same organizations, we were tasked to monitor if the elections, were held in a free and fair way. So we should monitor ourselves, and we had the same boss, both these, sections. And the first task, therefore, when we came out there, was to see if there was conditions for free and fair elections in Bosnia. And when we started to write our reports, basically all of us said no. There are no conditions for free and fair elections. I mean, in my area of responsibility, we had two nationalistic parties who dominated completely. They were, holding all positions in the municipalities, in the police. They were in the party. They controlled everything, and people were scared to death about these people. I can assure you that the ones who actually climbed to power during that kind of civil war that we had in Bosnia, it's not the nice guys. They were, to tell you frankly, they were thugs and they were criminals, and they were completely nationalistic. They were the ones who really believed that we cannot live together with the others. So no one else dared to challenge these people. So there were no others, to run for the elections, and that was what we reported in. And that resulted in that our boss, I will not mention his name, he called us in, all human rights officers, to a meeting in June '96. And he told us that no matter what you write in your reports, there will be elections. So from now on, you focus on the positive sides. I'm not sure we did that, but we had, of course, a discussion among ourselves. Should we all leave, or should we actually, as a protest, because this was ridiculous, or should we stay on and be able to tell about this afterwards? And most of us stayed on. A couple of people left, actually. And our boss, he leaked the whole story to Washington Post, I think, and he was fired. So, okay. So we had the elections, and the elections just, confirmed and legitimized these people in all the local municipalities. And after that, they controlled for, several years everything which was going on. And what was worse, they controlled also the developing money which came in afterwards. So this is one reason why it has been so difficult and so slow to actually implement the ideas behind the Dayton Agreement in Bosnia on that level. Another thing I just want to mention briefly then, since I have short of time, lack of coordination in the international community. When we really, if you talk about human rights and implement human rights, a right to fair trial, what is that? We need to have a judge who is educated and well paid, so he is not corrupt. The right not to be tortured, you need good policemen who knows how they can act. It's this concrete things actually which human rights are about. And one other thing we did, internationals in Bosnia, was that you know, we were not coordinated when we were going to rebuild the justice sector. So the French could send in one team which started with education for judges, for example. And you know, they have civil law background, the French. Then the British could come and start with some legislation. No, not legislation, maybe the British. But anyway, I mean, we came in with different legal traditions, started with different projects, which was not compatible when it came together. There we lost, you know, also a lot of money and a lot of time. And as I said, a lack of understanding maybe of the local context, a bit of naivety, you know. We thought that when we come and tell people what human rights is and non-governmental organizations, they will immediately start creating this. People didn't get the concept of independent organizations in that respect. So that has to come from under. So to conclude then, I still believe though, I really believe that human rights need to be part of a peace process. And I also believe that it needs to be a very strong part of the peace process. And I also believe here, which some people have been saying, that I think that you should really emphasize that it is important for both people, both the Israelis and the Palestinians here, to have human rights as a part of the peace process. How to achieve that? I mean, I think if you insist in having human rights experts in the negotiating team, or insisting on including the language, I mean, that you know best, of course. But it's still not enough that you have it in the text. In order to realize the human rights rhetoric, I think that you should be glad that you have all these NGOs. I mean, someone was saying that you are maybe too many NGOs, which might be true, but I think you should make use of that. But in the same way that a democracy can't survive without democrats, you of course need also an educated general public demanding human rights in order to really consolidate human rights. Thank you.
So we started with the theoretical level in our own region and go down into the nitty-gritty, and then I think a very useful, both in the positive and the negative, from another context. We take a round of questions and then responses from the panel, and then if we have time, another round of questions. Yes?
I would like to ask Agneta about...
It's helpful if you introduce, if the questioners also introduce themselves.
Okay, my name is Agneta. I'm a legal consultant at UNRWA, and I'm curious in which way the dating peace process takes up the right of return, which is a very controversial issue.
Other questions? Yes.
My name is Julio Laguardia, I'm a journalist. My question goes for Daniel Seidmann. Do you think this Dayton kind of treaty could have been imposed here on the two parties, and that could have been a means to avoid the intifada and the violent confrontation that we have had here for the last 3.5 years? Would have been feasible?
Yes, in the back.
I'm Gail Bowling, and I'm an independent researcher. I also helped as a freelancer to organize the conference, but I'm speaking in a personal capacity. Kind of bouncing off of Danny's presentation, but also everybody up there, Mohammed's and Agneta's and Professor. Of course, power politics rules the Middle East. It's ruled the Middle East for centuries. It's obvious, and it's obvious that this is the... Can you talk loudly? Sorry. Power politics rules in the Middle East and will rule the settlement, the negotiation process, and it's clear that the power dynamic here is so disparate. It is the most dramatic example of a disparity in power balances. of course, power politics will dictate the outcome. But as you said yourself, if you don't take into account the lives of the people, turning the West Bank into Gaza is not a solution for the Israelis. It doesn't lead to peace and security, and that's what you were saying. And so, in the end, the thing that we have to do is to demonstrate to Israeli citizens that it is in their interests to take into account the well-being of their future neighbors, because otherwise this will just go on. And I'm an American. I mean, it's happening to us now. Condoleezza Rice is saying she's expecting terror attacks before the election because she thinks that they'll try to do in America what happened in Spain. If people's lives are not taken into account, they will resort to violence. It's a sad fact. And I don't like what's happening in the Palestinian community. I don't like the fact that thuggery is on the rise, crime is on the rise. People are clearly walking around clinically depressed. They're not thinking straight. What kind of neighbors do you want to have? So it's a very fundamental point, and of course power politics will rule, but you said it yourself. If the people cannot live, the deal won't last. So it really begs the question, and the whole idea of pulling the plug on humanitarian aid and expecting that by doing so that somehow we will leverage a political deal out of that is, I think, rather short-sighted. I mean, you are basically asking, this discussion of whether we should stop humanitarian aid seems to me to be a way of shifting the burden off of the Israeli polity, the body politic here that needs to do its work to change the political system. This is the way I'm viewing it, and I'm throwing that out as a provocative bit of feedback. I cannot see how you can expect humanitarian aid organizations to stop doing their job, how that will somehow help. It doesn't matter to people like Sharon. That's what they want.
Thanks for that.
You can bounce off of that.
One more. We'll take 1 and 2 here.
My name is Agneta. I'm a psychologist, and I want to just point out very briefly how this defensive tendency to compartmentalize affairs is impeding both the human rights process and the conflict resolution. For example, we heard from Eddie Kaufman how at the university the conflict resolution is in one department and the human rights aspects, forces are in the other department. So we see in the university a tendency to compartmentalize affairs, even though they are very much connected human affairs. And then this compartmentalization of the university means that there's not enough interdisciplinary studies, so you cannot really see the connections between things which are really aspects of this of one and the same human phenomenon. Now, we also saw this in the previous session about the Israeli soldier who, when he sees the human rights people approaching, he says, oh, they're a bunch of leftists. So he's compartmentalizing people into leftists and rightists, and the leftists can be labeled as people who are troublemakers, and they really should not be taken into account, or else they should simply be confronted, arrested, and so on, as we heard in the case of the rabbis for human rights. And then we can also see it overall in the Arab-Israeli conflict when we compartmentalize ourselves on the other side. So we Israelis, for example, would say those Palestinians don't deserve human rights because they're killing us, the suicide bombers and so on. So they're bad and we are good and they don't deserve any human rights. I'm talking about people on the right, Israeli far right. So I'm saying all this compartmentalization is a very strong, powerful human defensive mechanism which is operating to impede both our understanding and our resolution of these things.
And just to your right, you had a question.
Just very short. I'm Jenny MacArthur and I'm an international activist. And I'd like my question to go to the Palestinian. I read a book called Palestine, Palestinians and International Law, in which Professor Boyle said that Palestine should declare itself a state. And also on the 10th anniversary of the First Intifada, he said that he advised that to sue Israel for genocide. And since then, things have got much, much worse for Palestine, and your talk was really quite pessimistic, I felt. And I wonder whether you feel Palestine can be saved by international law.
So I'm going to start.
The question was what Dayton says about the right of return. Maybe the Palestinians should not listen on that. All refugees and displaced persons have the right freely to return to their homes of origin. They shall have the right to have restored to them property of which they were deprived in the course of hostilities since 1991, and to be compensated for any property that cannot be restored to them. It's quite clear. So, again, you know, the main reason why it hasn't happened is, as I try to explain, that we ourselves sort of created these obstacles on the local level, where the local chief of police didn't implement the court order. But hopefully that is a question of time. And maybe I also should say that we can see now, of course, a growing interest and demand, especially from the younger generation. So they will, you know, take this forward, and then they really have the documents to go on. So in a way, I'm optimistic for Bosnia also.
The question of an imposed settlement. I'd like to caution against Deus ex machina, the ghost in the machine that's going to descend from heaven and put us out of our misery. And there's an element in that, in the desire for an imposed settlement. I don't think that the conditions exist or will exist in any kind of foreseeable future. But I would like to also say that it's not binary. The current impasse, the terrible situation in which we find ourselves, is not only based on the lack of will of the political leadership of Israelis and Palestinians to go the last mile towards a political agreement, but the lack of engagement by the international community, and particularly the President of the United States. And that engagement is critical. There are not two problematic leaders and actors in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there are three. Even over the last week, there has been a quantum drop in the engagement of the American administration and what's going on here on the ground. And it's frightening. It really is frightening. I think it's unprecedented to the extent that I think that we're going to be witness to actions that destabilize things. So I certainly am not cautioning against a large international engagement. The imposition of a settlement appears to be problematic. And this very much dovetails with what Gail mentioned. What disturbs me most about the Bush statement is much less the substance. The substance is it's not horribly shocking, but it is the medium of the message. And the medium is that it's a decollectivization of the Palestinians, a delegitimization, and they're simply not in the game. And you have true politicians, the shelf lives of which are somewhat questionable. One of them is going back to a ranch, one of them is going back to a farm, whether it's in 4 months, 2 years, we don't know. And we Slavs are going to be stuck here and talk about imposed settlements or what's involved. History has condemned Israelis and Palestinians to share this land, to share this city, and neither of us are going anywhere. And even a two-state solution is not going to change that fact, and that means that we should be encouraging not Israel arriving at peace with America, but Israel arriving at peace with Palestinians.
I want to address the question of Dr. Amr Falk about the problematic of these two separate camps and disciplines, if you want. There was some historic logic in a way, because just to give you some figures, in World War I, 90% of the casualties were military and 10% civilian. In World War II, with all the atrocities that we have been very much focusing on the last few days, 50% of the victims were military and 50% civilian. And now, in the last decade is 80% civilian, and in some periods it's 90% civilian. So it calls for integrating the treatment of civilians, and mostly non-state actors, and I don't have to tell you with terrorism, more so non-state actors, into the equation. If one thing was to make a peace agreement about the Antarctica, where nobody lives, this, it's a border dispute, international law goes there, or whatever, and you're really looking to peace by these old mechanisms. But what we have now in the world, and we are part of it, very much part of it, is what we call protracted communal conflicts. So it starts with a small massacre, an extrajudicial killing, it goes in the massacre becomes the genocidal situation, then there's an ethnic cleansing, and so on. And the main victims are civilians. So the logic to involve human rights is so evident that it's only in the minds of those who look in the past and not look at the present, not to understand this trend. Even in Israel-Palestine, most of the Israeli victims till this intifada, overwhelmingly were military. 90% of our casualties were military. But in this intifada, 2/3 of our casualties are civilians. So we really have to relate to that more and more. And it's really sad that, at the level of governmental level, these people are not even socialized into the idea of what human rights are. I don't even blame Sharon for not using it. I think he's never read anything to do with human rights, so he doesn't know what he's missing. Not that he read it and decided not to use it. Simply, he hasn't been socialized into this kind of conceptual framework. So talking about peace, I'm not talking about human rights, there is, and the same I'll say about Arafat. He thinks that, Palestinian people have rights, but he has never been kind enough to recognize the universal rights of other people. So this is a problem that, at the political level, as Daniel was saying, the politicians, they really don't see the long-term trends of processes as I was described. They didn't start with us. They didn't start yesterday. They're all along the way. And one more comment, I think if I understood the comment related to the importance of understanding that we have to accept human rights as a premise. I like to believe myself to be among the pragmatics, among the liberals. I like to believe myself, and that's why I'm agonizing about how to make a presentation to the top dog and see some people nodding and say, okay, that makes sense. Because that's really the problem, as I was saying. I'm saying now that if I know peace accords are going to deviate from universal principles, but if they don't put them in, and they don't know what these universal principles are, so what are the standards? And if the standards are only the discrepancy of power, the power gap, as you mentioned, then there is a serious problem, because human rights or international law helps to reduce the gap a little bit and to make things feel more equal. If you make a peace, or you force a peace, which is not a peace that people feel part of it, it's not going to last. That's another figure I can bring. 50% of the peace accords do not last more than 5 years. Boy, do we know that in our side, in our case, so much. So you have to get some satisfaction to the end of it. If you don't get enough satisfaction, it's not going to last. And therefore, I do think that it is absolutely pragmatic to start with some standard setting. And even if I know that at the end of the day, and by the way, there are conflicts of rights. Right of return, we have a serious conflict of right. We have to work on that, and maybe it will not all be resolved by the book. But we don't really look what the book looks like. And by the way, the law of return, from my perspective, or the right of return, because we are, from myself, they're both the same, Jews and Palestinians. The right to return to their homes, it doesn't have to do with if they were expelled or they ran away for fear, but we are so much back into our own issue that we don't know that the international law is saying to Israel, even if you expel them or not, they have the right to return. The question is, how do we compromise with that? Let's remember what's written in the book. So I think that it is only for the lasting peace that it's the Israeli side of the question, lasting security and so on, that we really have to start with human rights standards and then negotiate, as we all negotiate with realities.
Thank you. In Arabic, it's easy to respond for the word pessimistic, because we have a word that joins pessimistic and optimistic in one word, which is called متشائم. So it means the same thing. So I don't know whether I would start with being pessimistic or optimistic, but in an answer to your question about international law, I think that, and this is a conclusion that I reached personally, and this is my personal opinion, doesn't reflect the Office of the High Commissioner position, that under occupation you can have a full obedience to international humanitarian law by an occupier. But the moment you see an occupier implementing human rights, there is no occupation. Because this is the rule. Humanitarian law applies when there are occupation, when there is a conflict, when there is a civil strife, when there is two sides fighting each other. But the moment they start to implement human rights, the first article of both covenants speak about two issues. First of all, self-determination. Because the moment an occupier realizes the right in self-determination, and to have your own political and economic system, and to have full control over your natural and all other resources, then there is no occupation. Occupation leaves. So this is one answer of how to see the Israelis accept human rights norms and values. It means that it should start by ending occupation. So any future agreement that states respect for human rights, it starts from the recognition of the right to self-determination and implementation of all UN resolutions. I think officially we can say that maybe to see the international community implementing the UN resolutions in something similar to Dayton Agreement, or similar to the incorporation of human rights in the Good Friday Agreement between Ireland and it's something that we all want to see, and we think that it can put an end for a conflict, but it won't be lasting forever. It might last for 50 years if I want to be optimistic. But my personal opinion on that is totally different. I believe that we have seen too many initiatives, and we were always asked to think within a circle. We cannot think outside the circle. So they have drawn a line for us and said, think here. Two states all the time, or binational state, or democratic state. And I found one person in the Palestinian society who told me, we can have two states and share one state. So I think that two states and we can share everything, and we can put in details later on with anybody interested, is another model of how to have a lasting peace. Because I think there are things that we can compromise and things we cannot compromise, legally speaking. Issues of settlements, annexation of land, war crimes, all these collective punishment issues, all of the violations of the laws of war and humanitarian law cannot be compromised. But issues of water, issues of refugees, we can have creative solutions and we can reach a compromise. But there are issues we cannot. So maybe this would answer your question. But I think on humanitarian aid, I think we should also emphasize that there are two kinds of agencies or organizations or donors who are involved in humanitarian aid. Some has a full responsibility to connect between humanitarian aid and taking a position on that the cause for this need of humanitarian aid is occupation, and they should have a political position on that, and even legal position. The ICRC mandate came from the Geneva Conventions, so they have an obligation to monitor humanitarian law, and then to say that, okay, we provide humanitarian aid because there is a conflict, but this comes as a result of an aggressive or a military occupation. Other humanitarian agencies have no obligation. They just, wherever there is a crisis, whether it's natural or humankind disaster, they come and help, and we should be grateful to them. We hope that those who can visualize the oppression of a people and that this is not caused by God or by natural causes would go out and say, if you stop these violations, there is no need for humanitarian aid. If you don't demolish 100 houses in Rafah, there is no need for 100 tents. If you don't stop 200,000 people to make a living, you have to give them bread. So I think they should only have the obligation for their morals to say who is doing it. We don't want them to stand on one side against the other. So I think we should differentiate between those two. But those who would try to escape their obligation to connect it with the causes of the crisis, I think they are the ones that we should blame and ask them to change their position. Thank you.
So if there is one or two other burning questions, we take it. Otherwise, because it is quite a long day. So I thank our speakers, and I thank you all. And